In a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta, Terrence Washington adjusted his tie in the mirror. His dark eyes held a flicker of anticipation, but there was something else too, an unease he couldn't quite place. At 32, he was a rising star in real estate, a man who could sell anything to anyone. But tonight wasn't about business. Tonight, he was coming home early, bringing with him a carefully planned romantic dinner to surprise his wife of 6 months, Layla. Across town in the dimly lit office of St. Matthew's Church, Pastor Stephen Green sat hunched over his desk, deep in thought. His Bible lay open beside him, untouched. At 40, he was a man admired for his devotion, his words capable of stirring the soul. But beneath the sermons and the reverence, he carried a secret that threatened to destroy everything. And then there was Layla Washington, 28, an elementary school teacher adored by her students, known for her warmth and kindness. Just 6 months ago, she had stood before an altar, hand in hand with Terrence, while Pastor Green spoke of love, commitment, and faithfulness. That day had been perfect, a celebration of a love that should have lasted a lifetime. But perfection was an illusion. As the last traces of daylight faded, the stage was set for an ending far different than the one they had all envisioned. In the hours to come, trust would be shattered, love would turn to betrayal, and the thin veil of morality would be torn away, exposing the darkness that had been lurking all along. This is the story of that night, a night of love, deceit, and consequences that could never be undone. Layla's heels echoed through the empty church hallway, each step a reminder that it wasn't too late to turn back. The building was silent, its usual warmth replaced by an eerie stillness. Most of the staff had left hours ago, but she knew he would be there. He was always there, waiting. Her heart pounded as she approached the familiar door at the end of the corridor. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the doorknob. In her mind, she saw Terrence, his steady gaze, his unwavering devotion. She could still go home. She could still stop this. But the pull was stronger than the guilt. She turned the knob and stepped inside. Pastor Green looked up from his desk, his expression shifting the moment he saw her. His voice was quiet, heavy with something unspoken. "Layla," he murmured, rising to his feet. "I wasn't sure you'd come." She closed the door behind her, leaning against it. "I shouldn't be here," Layla murmured. But there was no conviction in her voice. Pastor Stephen Green stepped around his desk, closing the space between them. His eyes burned with something she didn't want to name. "But you are," he said softly, reaching up to brush his fingers against her cheek. "God works in mysterious ways, Layla. Maybe this is his plan for us." She almost laughed at the absurdity of it, the sheer blasphemy of justifying their affair as divine will. But when his lips met hers, all thoughts of morality, of consequence, of the man waiting for her at home, dissolved into nothing. She sank into Stephen's arms, surrendering to the desire that had been clawing at them both for months. Meanwhile, across town, Terrence Washington was preparing a different kind of evening. He moved with precision, setting out their best china, placing a bouquet of her favorite flowers at the center of the table. The aroma of her favorite meal filled the house. He had planned every detail, wanting tonight to be special. As he lit the last candle, a small, satisfied smile crossed his lips. He could already picture the look on her face when she walked through the door. But the minutes passed, then an hour. The smile faded. Terrence checked his phone. No missed calls, no messages. He dialed her number, listening as it rang, his heartbeat quickening when it went to voicemail. He forced a casual tone. "Hey baby, just wondering where you are. Give me a call when you get this, okay? Love you." He hung up, staring at the flickering candlelight, unease gnawing at him. Layla wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to disappear without a word. Something was wrong, he could feel it. Another hour passed and the tension became unbearable. Terrence grabbed his keys. He needed to find her. The streets of Atlanta blurred past as he drove, his grip tightening around the steering wheel. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had she been in an accident? Was she stranded somewhere? Or was it something else? He checked everywhere. The school where she worked, empty. The gym she sometimes visited, dark. The coffee shop where she liked to unwind, nothing. His gut twisted with unease. Then as he turned onto another street, a thought surfaced. The church. She had mentioned something about volunteering. Maybe she had lost track of time. Maybe she was still there. Or maybe he didn't let himself finish the thought. Terrence pressed down on the gas, heading straight for St. Matthew's Church. For a brief moment, the thought brought Terrence some relief. Maybe she really was here. Maybe it was all in his head. His grip on the steering wheel loosened slightly as he turned into the parking lot of Blessed Hope Baptist Church. The building loomed in the darkness, its steeple cutting into the night sky. Most of the windows were dark, but a faint glow seeped from a ground-floor office. His stomach knotted. Terrence parked, stepping out into the quiet night, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he approached, a muffled noise reached him through the silence. He froze. Then, as if needing confirmation, he took another step closer. The sounds sharpened, low murmurs, gasping breaths, the unmistakable rhythm of bodies moving together. For a second, his mind refused to process what he was hearing. His heart hammered against his ribs as he edged toward the window, pressing himself into the shadows. Through the gap in the blinds, he saw them. Layla, his wife, sprawled across the pastor's desk, her hair tangled, her hands gripping at him, her body moving against Pastor Stevens as though nothing else in the world existed. Terrence stumbled back as if struck, bile rising in his throat. The walls of reality collapsed around him, everything he had known and trusted crumbling in an instant. His beautiful wife, the woman he had promised to love forever, tangled in the arms of the man who had stood before God and blessed their marriage. His mind screamed at him to look away, to turn around and leave, but his body stayed rooted to the spot, forcing him to witness every whispered name, every shuddering breath, every betrayal. Then the pain gave way to something else, rage. It rose inside him like a firestorm, white-hot and merciless. His hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms, but he barely felt it. How dare they? How dare she? With him, of all people, the man who had preached about virtue and fidelity, the man who had counseled them, advised them, married them. Something inside Terrence snapped. The quiet, patient man who had spent the evening preparing a romantic surprise no longer existed. All that remained was fury. With a roar that shattered the silence, Terrence lunged at the door. The wooden frame exploded inward under the sheer force of his rage. The crash echoed through the empty church, splintering the illusion of secrecy. Inside, Layla and Stephen jerked apart, the pastor's face drained of color. Layla gasped, scrambling to cover herself, her eyes wide with terror. Terrence? She stammered. Oh God, I can explain. But there was no explanation. Not for this. The warmth in Terrence's eyes was gone, replaced by something cold and merciless. The betrayal, the sleaze, the sounds he could still hear ringing in his skull. They had made their choice. Now it was his turn. Terrence stood motionless, his breath ragged, his entire body trembling with rage. His gaze swept over the scene, the desk in disarray, clothes haphazardly discarded, his half-naked wife still flushed from her betrayal, and Pastor Stephen, disheveled and exposed. The weight of what he was seeing pressed down on him like a vice. How could you? His voice was low, raw, barely more than a growl. How could you do this to me, to us? Stephen, regaining his composure, took a hesitant step forward, hands raised in a pathetic attempt at control. Terrence, let's all calm down and talk about this. The words had barely left his lips before Terrence's fist collided with his jaw. Stephen staggered backward, knocking over a lamp. Talk? Terrence snarled, stepping forward. You want to talk now? After this? Layla screamed, scrambling between them, pressing trembling hands against Terrence's chest. Terrence, please, stop this. Just stop. But reason had long since abandoned him. Years of bottled-up frustration, the pressure of always being the good man, the faithful husband, the perfect provider, it all erupted in a violent storm of unrelenting fury. He shoved her aside, his focus locked solely on Stephen. The pastor barely had time to react before Terrence slammed into him, tackling him to the ground. He rained down fists, each strike fueled by betrayal and blind rage. You hypocrite, Terrence spat, his knuckles splitting against Stephen's face. You stand in that pulpit every Sunday preaching about faithfulness, About morality and this is who you really are? Stephen tried to fight back, but he was no match for the sheer force of Terrence's wrath. The room filled with the sickening sound of flesh meeting flesh, of muffled grunts, of bones cracking beneath the weight of violence. Layla's shrieks were distant now, drowned beneath the deafening roar of his fury. Then his hand closed around something cold, solid. A letter opener. It had fallen to the floor in the chaos. His grip tightened. "Terrence, no!" Layla's voice cut through the haze of rage, sharp with terror, but it was already too late. The blade plunged downward. Stephen's howl of agony shattered the air. Blood sprayed across the floor, splattered onto Terrence's hands, warm and slick, sinking into the fibers of his shirt. Stephen writhed beneath him, the letter opener embedded deep in his eye socket, a grotesque ruin of what had once been his face. For the first time since he had walked into that room, silence fell. Stephen's screams had dwindled to ragged gasps. Terrence stared, his own breath uneven, his heartbeat hammering so loudly he could hear it in his skull. The room reeked of sweat, of blood, of something far worse. Then he heard Layla. He turned toward her, and what he saw cut deeper than any blade ever could. The way she looked at him, not like a wife looking at her husband, like a woman staring at a monster. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Oh God, what have you done?" And then in the distance, sirens. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the church in an eerie glow. It was over. Everything, his marriage, his future, his entire life, was over. Detective Alicia Reeves stood at the threshold of the ruined office, the door frame splintered where brute force had broken through. Inside, the air was thick, copper, sweat, regret. She had worked homicides, seen the worst of people, but this was personal. Her partner, Detective Michael Chen, stepped up beside her, flipping open his notebook. Victims: Pastor Stephen Green, 45, and Layla Washington, 28. Suspect: Terrence Washington, 32, her husband. Walked in on them together. Didn't take it well. Reeves's eyes moved over the blood-slick floor, past the overturned desk, to the letter opener tagged and bagged as evidence. "The pastor?" she asked. Chen exhaled sharply. Still breathing, barely, took the letter opener straight to the left eye. "He's at Grady Memorial, but they don't expect to save it." Reeves's jaw tightened. She had seen men do a lot worse for a lot less. And the wife? Alive. Not a scratch on her, but she's a mess. Could barely get a word out. They took her in for questioning. The room reeked of ruin. Perfume still clung to the air, sickly sweet against the iron tang of blood. Everything, the scattered papers, the knocked-over lamp, the wreckage of a moment that should have never happened, told the same story. It wasn't just an act of rage. It was betrayal turned to destruction. Outside, the street had come alive despite the late hour. Neighbors whispered in hushed, horrified tones, their faces pale under the glare of flashing police lights. Blessed Hope Baptist Church had been a pillar of the community. Now it was a crime scene. Reeves could already see it. The headlines, the speculation, the vultures who would turn a man's breaking point into next week's entertainment. "This is going to be a media nightmare," Chen nodded grimly. "Affair, violence, a pastor caught in the middle. They'll eat it up." Reeves scanned the room once more, her eyes catching on a cracked photo frame. Pastor Stephen stood in the center, smiling, his arms wrapped around a beaming Terrence and Layla. The glass was fractured, the image distorted, just like their lives. She turned away, stepping back into the cold night air. This wasn't just another case. This was a man whose world had caved in, and now there was no going back. It was the kind of tragedy that didn't just stain a community, it festered in it. Whispers would spread like rot, forcing people to confront the truths they preferred buried. Faith, fidelity, the darkness that lived in even the most righteous hearts. Reeves exhaled slowly, starting the engine. It was going to be a long night, a longer investigation. And the truth, when she finally unraveled it, it would leave no one untouched. Not the victims, not the guilty, maybe not even herself. Inside the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting hard shadows across Terrence Washington's face. The blood was gone, scrubbed from his skin, but his knuckles, raw, swollen, still told the story of what he'd done. He sat hunched over the metal table, fingers clenched together so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Across from him, Detective Reeves didn't blink. Her gaze was steady, unreadable, giving him nowhere to hide. Beside her, Chen flipped through his notes, the soft rustle of paper the only sound in the stark, suffocating silence. "Mr. Washington," Reeves said finally, her voice cool, measured. "Walk us through it, in your own words." Terrence lifted his head slowly. His eyes met hers for a second before darting away, as if afraid of what they might reveal. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, hollow. I didn't mean for this to happen." He swallowed hard. "I just wanted to surprise her. Dinner, flowers, something nice. I thought we were happy." "Your wife," Chen prompted. Terrence let out a bitter laugh, but there was nothing humorous in it. 6 months. We were married 6 months. I thought we had our whole lives ahead of us." Reeves leaned forward slightly. "What made you go to the church?" His hands tightened into fists, knuckles white, jaw clenched. "She wasn't answering her phone. I got worried. Checked everywhere, her school, the gym, even that little cafe she loves." His breath hitched. "The church was the last place left." "And when you got there?" His breathing quickened. His stare went distant, like he was watching it happen all over again. "I saw them." His voice cracked. "Through the window. Her. Him." A tremor rippled through him. The way they... Jesus Christ. He broke off, shoulders shaking, hands running over his face as if he could wipe the memory away. Reeves and Chen exchanged a glance but said nothing. They let the silence settle. Let him drown in it. The truth was coming. It always did. "What happened next?" Reeves asked, quiet but firm. Terrence's head snapped up, and for a second, just a second, the rage flickered back to life. "I lost it." His breath came faster, harsher. "The woman I loved, the man who married us. How could they?" His fists hit the table, knuckles splitting open again, fresh blood welling at the surface. "So you kicked in the door." A sharp nod. "And then?" Terrence's lip quivered, his expression collapsing into something desperate, something shattered. "Then I made sure he'd never look at her again. It was like I wasn't even in control of my own body," Terrence muttered, his voice hollow. "All I could see was red. I wanted him to feel it, feel what I was feeling." Reeves didn't react, didn't flinch. "And the letter opener?" Her tone was measured, steady, giving him no room to hide. Terrence's face twisted in anguish. "I didn't mean to. I swear to God, I didn't mean to. It was just there, and I was so angry." His breath hitched, his fingers gripping his own wrists like he was trying to hold himself together. "Oh God, what have I done?" His body shook, a man unraveling, but Reeves didn't let herself soften. She had seen this before. Regret after the rage had burned out. But regret didn't undo violence. It didn't change what was done. "Mr. Washington?" She leaned in slightly, her voice quiet, controlled. "Do you understand the severity of your actions? Pastor Stephen may lose his eye. You're looking at aggravated assault, maybe attempted murder." Terrence nodded, slow, mechanical. His eyes were vacant. "I understand. I'll take whatever punishment comes, but please, you have to believe me. I never meant for it to go this far. I'm not a violent man. His breath shuddered. "I just loved her. I loved her so much." Love. Betrayal. Violence. It was the same story told 1,000 times over. A tragedy without innovation, but never without weight. Beyond the sterile walls of the interrogation room, Atlanta pulsed with the scandal. In diners, in homes, in church pews, people whispered their own versions of the story. Who was the villain? Who was the victim? Who deserved what? But in this room, under the cold glare of fluorescent lights, there were no easy answers. Only wreckage. Down the hall, another interrogation room. Another broken life. Layla Washington sat wrapped in a standard-issue blanket, her arms tight around herself as if she could hold in everything spilling out. Her eyes, rimmed raw from crying, flickered up at Detective Chen, who sat across from her, patient but unrelenting. "Mrs. Washington," he said gently, "I know this is difficult, but we need to understand what led to tonight. Can you tell me about your relationship with Pastor Stephen? Her fingers trembled against the cool glass of water she held. When she spoke, her voice barely carried across the room. It wasn't supposed to happen. Chen remained silent, waiting. I love Terrence, I do. A pause, a long, painful breath. But with Stephen, it was different. How so? Layla swallowed, her shame thick in the air. Terrence is a good man, kind, hardworking, but sometimes it felt like he didn't really see me. Her lip quivered, like I was just playing a role, the perfect wife, the supportive partner. But with Stephen, I felt seen, understood. Chen's pen scratched against his notepad. When did it start? 3 months ago. She shut her eyes briefly as if she could will away the past. I was helping with youth group paperwork. We talked, and I don't know, there was just this connection. And tonight, Layla's eyes filled with fresh tears. I knew it was wrong. Too late for that now. Every time I told myself it would be the last. But then Stephen would call, or I'd catch sight of him at church, and I couldn't resist. I was weak. Layla's voice cracked as she spoke, the words barely escaping her lips. The confession hung in the air, a twisted form of relief tangled with guilt. Detective Chen leaned in, his expression unwavering, calm. Did you ever think about telling Terrence? He asked. A bitter laugh escaped Layla's lips, hollow and sharp. How could I? He idolized Stephen. He thought he was some kind of saint, the perfect man. Our marriage, everyone thought we were this perfect couple. She paused, her face drained. I didn't want to shatter that illusion. But the illusion shattered anyway, Chen said softly. Layla's shoulders slumped as the weight of her actions settled in. She nodded. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, especially not like this. Oh God, Stephen's eye, and Terrence, the look on his face when he burst in. I'll never forget it. Not as long as I live. Tears once more blurred Layla's eyes as she broke down. Chen sat in silence, watching her. He thought about how love, desire, and betrayal could build people up, or destroy them, leaving only wreckage in their wake. Elsewhere at Grady Memorial Hospital, Pastor Stephen Green lay motionless in his bed, his left eye bound in heavy bandages. Detective Reeves stood beside him, her demeanor cold and detached, a stark contrast to the turmoil surrounding them. Pastor Green, she began, her voice steady but stern. I know you're in pain, but I need to ask you a few questions about your relationship with Layla Washington. Stephen turned his head slightly, his single visible eye filled with a mixture of pain and regret. He spoke through gritted teeth, his voice hoarse. I've sinned, he rasped. I've betrayed my calling, my congregation, and a good man who trusted me. Whatever punishment comes, I deserve it. Reeves didn't flinch. That may be, she replied, but right now I need facts. How long has this affair been going on? Stephen closed his eye, a tear slipping down his cheek as he sighed deeply. 3 months, he confessed. It started innocently enough. Counseling sessions, talks about her marriage. But somewhere along the line, it became more. Did you ever consider ending it? A bitter smile crossed Stephen's face, but it didn't reach his eyes. Every day, every single day, I prayed for strength to resist temptation. But then I'd see her, and all my resolve would crumble. Reeves made a note of this, her expression impassive. And tonight, why risk meeting at the church? Foolishness, Stephen admitted, his voice thick with shame. We're selfish foolishness. We thought we were being careful, but I guess no secret stays buried forever. Reeves listened, her mind churning with the gravity of his words. The irony was almost too much to bear. A pastor, a man supposed to guide others on the path of righteousness, brought low by the same failings he'd preached against every Sunday. Back at the police station, as the first light of day began to break over Atlanta, the interviews painted a grim picture. It was a tragedy born from a perfect storm of human frailty, love, lust, betrayal, and rage, all colliding in a single catastrophic moment. The city stirred around them, blissfully unaware of the destruction that had unfolded in the night. But for the three caught in its aftermath, their lives were in ruins. In the harsh light of day, the long road of reckoning, personal, legal, and spiritual, had only just begun. As the news of the scandal broke, it spread through Atlanta like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of shock, outrage, and disbelief. The story had all the hallmarks of a tragedy that could tear apart a community. A revered pastor caught in an affair, a betrayed husband pushed to the brink of violence, and a town left shattered in its wake. At Blessed Hope Baptist Church, the congregation gathered in a stunned silence, struggling to comprehend the fall of their spiritual leader. Deacon Walter Simmons, a lifelong friend of Pastor Stephen, stood solemnly at the pulpit, his face twisted with sorrow and disappointment. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice heavy with grief, "we have been dealt a grievous blow. Our shepherd has strayed from the path of righteousness, and in doing so, has brought pain and suffering upon this community." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some wept openly, others sat in stony silence, their faith hanging by a thread. The foundation of their trust had crumbled beneath them. "But let us remember," Deacon Simmons continued, his words weighed down by the gravity of the situation, "we are all sinners in the eyes of the Lord. It is not for us to judge, but to pray for Pastor Stephen's recovery, for healing for the Washington family, and for guidance as we navigate these troubled waters." As the makeshift service came to a close, small groups formed in the church parking lot, their voices low as the reality of the betrayal settled in. "I just can't believe it," whispered Sarah Johnson, a Sunday school teacher, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Pastor Stephen always seemed so righteous. How could he do this?" "And poor Terrence," added Robert Lee, shaking his head in sorrow, "to catch your wife with another man, in the church of all places. It's no wonder he snapped." "But to take the man's eye," countered Amelia Foster, her voice tinged with horror. "There's no justification for that kind of violence, no matter what happened. It doesn't give Terrence the right to play judge, jury, and executioner." As the day wore on, the story consumed every corner of the city. Local news channels were flooded with updates. Outside the courthouse, a throng of reporters clamored for position, desperate for a glimpse of Terrence Washington as he was due to be arraigned. The questions came fast and relentless. "Mr. Washington, how do you plead? Do you regret your actions? What do you have to say to Pastor Stephen and your wife?" But Terrence remained silent, his head bowed in defeat, as he was ushered into the courthouse flanked by his lawyer and two grim-faced officers. At Grady Memorial Hospital, another media frenzy had taken root. Reporters gathered in the parking lot, their cameras trained on the entrance, waiting for any news of Pastor Stephen's condition. Inside the sterile walls of the hospital, Stephen lay in his bed, his ruined eye wrapped in bandages, the weight of his sins pressing down on him like a physical burden. The pain in his eye was nothing compared to the weight of his conscience. A nurse entered, carrying a small vase of flowers. She set it down gently on the bedside table. "These just arrived for you, Pastor," she said softly, as though the flowers could somehow redeem what had already been lost. Stephen's gaze lingered on the flowers, his mind racing through the wreckage of his own choices. The affair, the lysis, the betrayal. Everything he had preached against for years now stared back at him, a cruel reflection of the man he had become. And as the flowers sat untouched, the world outside continued to spin, unchanged, unforgiving. Stephen turned his head slightly, his one remaining eye falling on the card attached to the bouquet. "From your flock at Blessed Hope," it read, "we are praying for your recovery in body and in spirit." A sharp, painful lump caught in Stephen's throat. The kindness of his congregation, even after his betrayal, was almost unbearable. It felt like a final cruelty, too much to process, too much to deserve. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Layla Washington sat alone, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages from friends, family, and even strangers. She ignored them all, consumed by a heavy haze of guilt, regret, and a sinking dread of the future. On the coffee table before her lay a stack of newspapers, each one bearing the brutal, public details of her affair. Pastor's unholy liaison, husband's revenge, faith and fidelity shattered. The words screamed at her from every angle, every inch of the page, a relentless reminder of the wreckage she had caused. Layla picked up one of the papers, her trembling hands scanning the article. Her life, her entire, carefully constructed life, was now out in the open. Her background as a beloved elementary school teacher, her seemingly perfect marriage to Terrence, the shocking revelation of her affair with Pastor Stephen, all laid bare. The article made no attempt to soften the blows, exposing everything to public judgment. Her whole existence had been stripped to its raw, scandalous core. As she read, a fresh wave of tears flooded her eyes. How had it come to this? A single moment of weakness, a forbidden passion, and now everything she had known was gone. Her career, destroyed. No parent would ever trust her again after this scandal. Her marriage, shattered. Her reputation, nothing but ashes. Yet, amidst the wreckage, a dark, selfish part of her couldn't stop thinking of Stephen. Was he okay? Would he ever forgive her for her role in his ruin? And Terrence, oh, Terrence. The look of rage and betrayal on his face was something she would never be able to erase from her memory. It would haunt her for as long as she lived. As night fell once again over Atlanta, the city hummed with gossip, judgment, and whispered opinions. In homes, bars, and coffee shops, people debated furiously about the morality of the affair, about Terrence's violent reaction, and about what this meant for the community's faith and values. But for the three at the center of it all, Terrence, Layla, and Stephen, the night offered no solace. Only isolation. Only the crushing weight of what had been done and the consequences that were already beginning to take shape. Each of them, alone in their thoughts, faced the long dark hours before dawn. They knew that when the sun rose, it would shine on a world forever altered by their actions. The scandal had shaken Atlanta to its very core, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of humanity, the complexity of love and betrayal, and the painful reality that even the most devout and righteous among us are capable of falling from grace. As the legal process began to unfold, one thing was certain: the repercussions of that fateful night would echo for years to come, leaving scars that would never fully heal. It was a grim reminder that no matter how high one climbs, the fall is always waiting.